The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their steady hum joining the scrape of boots and low chatter that filled the corridor. The marble floor gleamed where it was polished, and in the spaces still dull with dust and tracked mud, Sophia pushed her mop with patient, rhythmic strokes. Her gray uniform was shapeless, sleeves rolled up just enough to keep the water from soaking her arms, her sneakers frayed from wear. To anyone passing by, she was nothing more than part of the background, another cleaner drifting unseen through the hallways of the base. But her presence never escaped notice, not from the young men in fresh fatigues or the junior officers with their easy smirks. She couldn't cut it, so they stuck her here, one whispered, not as quietly as he thought. Another laughed under his breath. From rifle to mop handle, guess not everyone's SEAL material. The words carried farther than they realized. Sound had a way of amplifying in those long, echoing halls, sliding along polished walls and sharp corners. Sophia's hands tightened briefly around the mop handle, knuckles whitening before she relaxed again. She didn't look up. She didn't meet their eyes. The mop glided forward, dragging a thin film of water across the floor until the dull stone shone. Her movements were calm, almost mechanical, but inside every syllable landed like a stone in her chest. She had heard it all before: cleaner, failure, useless. They were words wrapped in smirks, tossed casually over shoulders by people who believed they had her figured out. The uniform she wore only confirmed the story in their minds. An underqualified dropout kept around for menial labor. A joke. One recruit, his voice carrying louder than the others, scoffed as he passed. "Careful with that mop, sweetheart. Wouldn't want you to strain yourself." His friends chuckled, the sound sharp and fleeting like knives on glass. Sophia pressed the mop harder into the floor, letting the strain run through her shoulders. She didn't look up, didn't answer. To respond would be to acknowledge them, and she had learned long ago that silence had its own kind of strength. But silence didn't mean the words didn't cut. Every comment dug deep, scraping against memories she had buried under layers of routine. She paused for a moment, wringing out the mop in the bucket beside her, watching the water ripple and cloud. Her reflection in the murky surface was faint, distorted, almost unrecognizable. The woman staring back was a shadow, plain and unremarkable, stripped of the identity she had once carried with pride. No one looking at her now could have guessed who she had been, what she had endured, or the battles that had carved their marks deep into her bones. To them, she was only the cleaner. A pair of officers strode past, their polished boots leaving damp tracks she would need to chase down. One of them leaned toward the other, not even bothering to lower his voice. Imagine falling that far. Must eat her up inside. Sophia kept her head bowed, her mop sliding into the prints they left behind, erasing them one by one. Each stroke steadied her breathing, each sweep a reminder of control. She could not silence their laughter, but she could command her own response. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the wet marble as she moved down the corridor, her figure small against the grandeur of the hall. The recruits clustered near the far end, still whispering, still watching her with sideways glances. They thought they had her measured, but their world was narrow, their experience shallow. All they saw was a woman bent over a mop, shoulders hunched, hair tucked under a cap that shaded her expression. They saw nothing of the soldier who had once carried weight heavier than any ridicule. She finished another section of the floor, dipping the mop again, water dripping in slow arcs back into the bucket. The hall quieted as footsteps moved elsewhere, voices fading until only the hum of the lights and the swish of her mop remained. Alone, Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The sting of their words lingered, but she pushed them down as she always did, pressing them into the silence of her work. They could not see it, and she would not show it. What they thought of her now didn't matter, not yet. What mattered was the rhythm of the mop, the steady repetition that kept her anchored, even as shadows of who she had been flickered in the edges of her memory. To the hall, to the recruits, to the officers, she was invisible, a cleaner, nothing more. But Sophia knew different. And deep down, Beneath the plain uniform and worn sneakers, so did the silence. The marble hall was transformed that morning. Flags hung from the high rafters, their edges perfectly aligned, every fold crisp. Rows of recruits lined the walls, their uniforms freshly pressed, boots gleaming under the lights. Reporters clustered near the back, cameras at the ready, murmuring with the restless energy of people eager for spectacle. The air carried a strange mix of nerves and ceremony, sharp cologne mingling with the faint tang of polished brass. Sophia worked quietly at the edge of it all, her mop gliding over the floor in deliberate arcs, tracing light into the dull patches of stone. She was careful, purposeful, blending into the backdrop as though she were part of the architecture itself. Few noticed her, and those who did dismissed her as they always had, a cleaner, out of place among the shine of uniforms and medals. She had long grown used to being invisible. Then the double doors opened. The sound of boots on marble cracked through the hall like a drumbeat. The commander entered, flanked by senior officers, his stride measured and absolute. The ceremony had not yet begun, but his presence carried with it an authority that demanded silence. Conversations halted mid-sentence, the rustle of papers stilled. Even the faint laughter that had lingered among a group of recruits near the far wall evaporated. Every eye turned toward him. He was a man of height and gravity, his posture unbending, the weight of his uniform not a burden, but an extension of who he was. The medals across his chest caught the light in sharp glints, each one a story untold. His gaze swept the hall, not hurried, not casual. It was the kind of gaze that measured, that weighed, that saw. And then it stopped. Sophia felt it before she dared look up. A subtle tightening in the air, a silence that pressed heavier than before. She raised her eyes cautiously. Her mop paused mid-swipe, water dripping slowly back into the bucket. The commander's stare had landed on her, cutting through the space between them as though no one else existed in the hall. Without warning, he barked a phrase. It was sharp, clipped, each syllable striking the air like the crack of a whip. Foreign to most ears, it carried the rhythm of command, the kind that brooked no hesitation. It was not English, nor any language common to the base, but something deeper, older, meant only for those who had once lived under its weight. The room froze. Reporters frowned, pens hovering uselessly over their notepads. Recruits shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between one another, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. A nervous laugh sputtered from somewhere in the back, quickly smothered. The words had rolled over them like a storm they could not name, leaving them rooted in place. Sophia's chest tightened. Her grip on the mop handle faltered, then steadied. She knew that command, not in memory alone, but in muscle and marrow. The syllables rang like a bell in her mind, pulling her back to nights when the air reeked of smoke and dust, when cries for help mixed with the roar of gunfire. That phrase had meant one thing only: brace, gather, move. Her heart hammered, but her body moved before her thoughts caught up. The mop handle slipped from her grasp, clattering against the bucket with a hollow echo. The sound drew startled glances, but she didn't see them. Her feet carried her forward, step by deliberate step, as though compelled by a gravity that no one else could feel. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished floor, each echo magnified in the silence. The commander did not move. He stood at the center of the hall, his posture rigid, eyes locked on her with the unyielding patience of a man who already knew the outcome. Around them, confusion rippled through the recruits. Some whispered, some stiffened, but no one dared to speak louder than a breath. All laughter was gone now. Sophia's throat was dry, but her steps did not falter. She crossed the expanse of the hall, the vast space shrinking with every stride, her past pressing in with every heartbeat. She was no longer just the cleaner. The words he had spoken had stripped that disguise away, leaving only the part of herself she had tried to bury. And she knew everyone watching would see it too. Step by step, Sophia crossed the hall, and with each soft squeak of her sneakers the present thinned. The marble under her feet became gravel, then cracked tile, then a patchwork of dirt and blown glass in some city whose name had never appeared on the evening news. She could smell antiseptic cut with diesel, taste metallic dust on the back of her tongue. The commander's order hung in the air like a flare, and her body answered it the way it always had without permission from fear or doubt. Her fingers flexed at her sides, remembering habits her days as a cleaner could not erase. Counting respirations by feel, checking for bright red bleed with one glance, hearing the difference between a scream and a choke even when both came at once. She had taped broken ribs with jungle tape in the dark, whispered jokes to a boy younger than her who bled anyway, marked foreheads with a grease pencil when there was no time to keep records. She knew the weight of a man when he was about to go, how it changed in your arms like something quietly giving up. The hall swam with faces, recruits, officers, reporters, but the ghosts were nearer and louder, and they stepped aside as she moved. Halfway to the dais, she stopped and raised her chin. The commander hadn't blinked. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep, like someone who had stared into weather he could not control and learned to stand through it. He gave the same sharp phrase again, clipped shorter this time, the kind of test that reveals what's real and what is a guess. She felt it settle inside her ribs like a key sliding into an old lock. Sophia answered. Not English. Not any language they taught on this base. She gave it back in the same cadence, the same compression of syllables, and then she added the countersign, two brisk words that widened the commander's stance almost imperceptibly and pulled an audible gasp from somewhere behind the cameras. The sound rolled across the hall. A few recruits straightened on instinct. A reporter's pen scratched and then went still. What had been curiosity turned into alert attention, the way a unit quiets when it realizes the plan everyone rehearsed is about to be replaced by the one that actually works. The commander nodded once. Proceed, he said, the single English word landing like a permission she hadn't known she needed. Her throat was dry, but her voice came steady, low, carrying farther than she expected in the hush. She gave her name first, the full one she hadn't spoken aloud in months. Sophia Reyes. She did not add cleaner, did not apologize for where she stood. The rank followed, old muscle memory aligning her shoulders when she said it. Sergeant. A ripple moved through the recruits at the Army title inside a Navy hall, but no one breathed too loud. She finished with the unit, each letter dropped cleanly into the space between them. Special Operations Medical Detachment Kestrel. Attached to Task Unit Grey Raven. At the back, a camera shutter hiccuped and then fell silent. A junior officer frowned like he'd heard those words somewhere he wasn't supposed to. Someone else whispered, I thought that unit, and didn't finish. Kestrel hadn't been on any roster here for years. Most only knew it in rumor. A small team that landed in places no map acknowledged, that ran under other people's flags and left no patches behind. They were the kind of quiet that never made the ceremony program. Designation? The commander asked. SOCM, she replied. Special Operations Combat Medic. The syllables fit her mouth like her own name. He came down from the dais. The movement felt wrong and right at once. Wrong because men with his weight didn't descend before the script told them to. Right because the script had been rewritten the second he barked that order and she answered. He took the steps evenly, boots sounding a cadence that the hall unconsciously matched, breath by breath. Up close, he wasn't larger, he was clearer, and the lines of his life were easier to read. There were scars that his barber couldn't hide, and a stiffness in one shoulder that spoke a language she knew by sight, old damage that flared when the air turned or sleep ran shallow. They stopped an arm's length apart. The hall held its breath. The commander looked at her without searching for what he wanted to see. He'd already found it. She felt the room almost calculate the wrongness of what came next, and then the new math they would have to learn. He brought his hand up sharp, clean, not a fraction off. The salute cut through the stillness like a seam opening, and for a heartbeat nothing moved but his fingers and the quick light on his insignia. For a commander to render first honors in this place, to a woman in a cleaner's uniform, was not in any manual. It broke a pattern that many trusted without thinking. It broke the laughter in the throats of the recruits who had dragged it like a blade across her back for weeks. It broke open the version of her that had been forced into a corner and told to stay small. Sophia returned the salute. Her hand rose on its own, colliding with the ache of muscles that remembered, and the sting of calluses that never entirely went away. Her eyes did not waver. She did not look away from the man who had called her back from the life she'd folded into squares and stored on a closet shelf. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, voice low enough that the words belonged to them first, then to the room. "We believed Kestrel lost." "Not lost," she answered, the language switching back to the old code for the next sentence, because some truths needed to be said where only a few could hear them clearly. "Survivors," the code meant. Consolidated, awaiting tasking that never came. He absorbed it with a single blink, then shifted to address the space behind her without taking his eyes off hers. "Note this," he said, and the scribble of pens resumed, hurried now, reverent in a way that writing rarely is. Around them, the hall reassembled itself into the ceremony it had been an hour before, but everything had shifted on its axis. The recruits who had laughed stared at a point just above her shoulder, cheeks hollowed by the sudden weight of understanding. The junior officers stood taller, not for themselves, but to keep level with a moment that asked more of them. The reporters kept their distance, their questions held back by something that wasn't fear and wasn't politeness. The commander's hand dropped. The salute was over, but its imprint remained, like a hand pressed into wet cement that would harden and last. "Stand easy," he said at last, a command to the room and a release to her, and the words spread in soft waves. Sophia let her arm fall. Her heart had steadied. The mop bucket waited somewhere behind her like a different life she could still step back into, but she didn't turn yet. She stood there a breath longer, shoulders square, the corridor of her past aligned with the breadth of this hall, and in the line between them she could finally see herself clearly. The hall was utterly still, as though time itself had stopped to let the weight of the salute sink into the marble. The recruits, who only minutes before had smirked and whispered about the cleaner in her worn sneakers, now stood stiff-backed, their mouths shut, their faces drawn pale. Not a single laugh remained among them. They looked at Sophia with the kind of uneasy awe that comes when the ground tilts beneath everything you thought you knew. The woman they had mocked had just been saluted by the commander of the SEALs, an honor some of them could only dream of earning after years of service. The commander let his gaze travel the hall, sweeping across the rows of soldiers and officers alike, but his words were for all of them. His voice carried, firm but resonant, and it filled every corner. Bravery doesn't need a stage. It never fades, and it never hides forever. The sentence struck the air like a bell. Reporters who had been fumbling for context stopped writing mid-scribble. Officers drew in slow, steady breaths, their chests rising in quiet acknowledgement. And the recruits, the ones who had called her failure, who had sneered at the mop in her hands, straightened their spines as though the weight of their own mockery had suddenly settled like stone across their shoulders. It began softly, a single pair of hands clapping in the back, hesitant and reverent. Then another joined, louder and another, until the sound gathered strength and swelled into a tide. Applause rolled through the hall, not the polite kind demanded by protocol, but a raw, unfiltered respect that came from somewhere deeper. Boots struck the ground in rhythm, a few officers adding sharp nods that matched the cadence. The cameras flashed in stuttered bursts, capturing not just the commander but her, the cleaner who was no cleaner at all, the medic who had survived missions that were never meant to be remembered. Sophia lowered her head slightly, shoulders curved as though trying to shrink herself back into the safety of anonymity. Humility pulled at her, telling her to retreat, but her eyes betrayed her. They burned, fierce and alive, the quiet pride of someone who had never asked for recognition but found it thrust upon her anyway. She blinked once, steadying herself against the tide of faces now turned toward her. For years she had walked these halls unseen, blending into corners, her worth buried under whispered jokes. Now, invisibility was gone, and though part of her ached for the comfort of silence, another part older, stronger, stood tall inside her. The commander gave a final nod, stepping back toward the dais, his message already etched into the hall without need for repetition. The applause softened, tapering into silence, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the quiet of dismissal or disregard. It carried weight, the hush of reverence, the kind of silence soldiers hold in the presence of something sacred. Sophia turned at last. The mop and bucket waited where she had left them, unremarkable, ordinary tools of her disguise. She crossed back, each step measured. Her shoulders neither slumped nor squared in defiance. She simply moved as herself. She picked up the mop handle once more, fingers curling around the wood with practiced ease. The hall did not laugh. The recruits did not whisper. No one dared to meet her eyes with anything but acknowledgement. She resumed her work, the mop sliding across the marble, water shining in her wake. But the air was changed. The echo of her steps and the rhythm of her strokes no longer carried the sting of mockery. They carried the quiet respect of those who had seen who she truly was. And when she glanced over her shoulder, just once, the commander was still watching her, not as a cleaner, not even as a subordinate, but as a soldier whose courage had refused to die, even when the world had turned its back. For the first time in years, Sophia felt the truth settle inside her like a steady flame. She had been seen. She had been heard, and she had been honored.